welcome to Great Shot Kid, the Nerd Party's show in which we look at the people who make Star Wars. I'm Mike. John is off on his wild adventure across the universe and all that good stuff. But with me, I have an actual person who makes Star Wars, Nick. How's it going, Nick?
It's going great. I'm very happy to be on board for this episode, and I hope I do okay. John's shoes are big shoes to fill. You guys are quite a pair together, so I hope I'll do all right.
Well, I appreciate that, but I mean, sometimes it's good for a change. Sometimes you need the Ewan McGregor instead of the Alec Guinness or whatever, and it's all good.
I'll take being Ewan McGregor. That's cool. I'm all right with that.
So Nick, like I said a few seconds ago, you actually have worked on the franchise. What is it that you've done?
Well, first, I started by being a huge fan of Star Wars. That was my first work on the franchise. So I consumed it copiously, and then I was lucky enough to have my dream come true and start working at Lucasfilm in the early mid '90s. And so as I was working my way up in editorial, I was an assistant editor on Episode 1 on prequels, and I was an editor on Episode 2. And then I eventually I was at ILM at the time. I left ILM in the early 2000s and went to the ranch and worked with George Lucas and Dave Filoni on the Clone Wars, and I became one of the two editors on the Clone Wars for the entire run. So I was there for 7 years, working with George and Dave, and then came back to ILM after we wrapped up after the sale to Disney and George retired, and resumed working at ILM, where I was lucky to work on The Force Awakens for a little bit. My friend Greg was the senior editor at ILM for The Force Awakens, but I got to fill in for him for a few weeks while he had to go away. And then after that, I was lucky also to be sent to London to work on it for about a month or so, towards in the last 3 or 4 months of production. And that's the extent of my work on Star Wars so far.
That's all you've done so far, is just like edited like 7 seasons of the Clone Wars. That's all you've done. Okay. I mean, that is super cool. I mean, I don't know. Editing is like one of those things which fascinates me to no end, and it's really cool to talk to you, and I can't wait to talk to you about that, about what it was like to edit under people like Dave Filoni and George Lucas, but we'll get to that next week. This week I figure, okay, got someone who's worked on the franchise, here and everything like that. Someone who's worked on the prequels and the sequels and the Clone Wars and all that stuff, and done visual effects, for years and years and years. So I figured it would be a good idea to talk to you about the Book of Henry, because it's basically the same thing. I mean, it's effects heavy, whatever, from the director of Jurassic World and all that stuff. But hey, it's very strange because we'll get into this, and maybe we can just get into this now. Book of Henry, the reason why I wanted to talk about it on this show, and I was very, very adamant that we do, is because it's directed by Colin Trevorrow, who of course is the director of Episode 9, and it's not insignificant that he has a new movie coming out. It's not insignificant that this is what he chose to do before jumping into the franchise, And, coming off of Jurassic World, where everyone was like, okay, that was, an amazing return to greatness or whatever for the franchise, that franchise. And, after it made, $37 billion, it felt to me almost like, when they announced, like, he's directing Episode 9, my reaction was like, yeah, I guess that makes absolute perfect sense. That is the exact person who you would get, because he basically, did all of the things that they're hoping someone will do on episode 9. But at the same time, I was not really tremendously excited about that choice because it was so obvious. I mean, when they say like, "Oh, we're getting the guys who made 22 Jump Street to make a Han Solo movie," I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." But if you say like, we're getting this guy who's worked with George Lucas since before Star Wars to come in and make a Han Solo movie, I'm like, that's kind of obvious. Although I do like Ron Howard quite a bit, you know what I mean. But my point is, here we have Colin Trevorrow doing something which is way outside the Jurassic World episode 9 norm, and we kind of get to see him do something on his own, like left to his own devices in a sense. And what is that going to be? And a lot of people have a lot of opinions about this movie, but I don't know, Nick. Because I asked so many people to talk to me about this show, and they're all like, "No, I'm not interested in that at all. I'm not interested in seeing the Book of Henry. No way, no, no, no." And when I asked you, you were like, "Yeah, sure, I'll see
I
that."
was gung ho. Yeah, yeah. I was. It's funny because I remember you asked me, and you instantly kind of said, "But if you don't want to, don't worry. It's okay. I understand." And I said, "No, I'm totally there. I love the trailer. I mean, I've always had a huge crush on Naomi Watts and on Silverman, and I guess that's outside the boundaries of Colin Trevorrow, but then that certainly didn't hurt. But regardless of that, actually, when I first saw the trailer, I got really excited, and I'm happy to say it's one of those times where I got excited for the same reason that I actually love the movie, and I had a little bit of trepidation towards like right before seeing it, because I saw the trailer and I got really psyched for certain things about it. And then, I saw the reviews, and I tend to not pay too much attention or not care. I make my own opinions, but it was getting panned hard. And so, knowing also how deceptive trailers can be, I thought, well, shoot, maybe it's one of those cases where I'm not going to see what I thought or what I wanted to see. And I have to say, I saw exactly what I thought, hoped, and wanted to see. And so I got really excited on the way out of that movie.
And it's really interesting to hear you say that. Like, I had a very different sort of backstory to this movie going into it, because I've been on this kick for the past few months where I've basically just stopped watching trailers, and I mean, like, it's one of those things where it's like, I know I'm going to go see the new Colin Trevorrow movie. Like, you don't need to tell me what it's about. Like, I don't need any more convincing. So why would I essentially ruin it for myself when I could just go into it completely blind and have, in some ways, I think, a more rewarding experience, And this is one of the first movies since I started this where I knew literally nothing about the movie going into it. And I was, I had heard of the movie and everything, and I, like I said, I was asking people, and the reactions were really weird, because a lot of people were saying, like, I have no interest, that movie looks terrible, but there were also a lot of people, like, for example, Aggressive Negotiations, Matt Rushing, who is a huge fan of Jurassic World, and obviously a big Star Wars fan. I asked him, and he's like, I don't know what that movie is. I've never heard of that movie before. And I'm like, really? Like, it comes out next week. I thought, I mean, it's so strange. And that was like the general reaction was like, what is this thing? And I'm like, wow. Because, like, you think about, like, if Rian Johnson had a new movie coming out, like a little indie movie coming out right now, like, the internet would be on fire, Everyone would be looking forward to that movie so much just because it was Rian Johnson. But Colin Trevorrow, even though he's made Jurassic World, which everybody saw and loved, and he's about to make episode 9, he comes out with his little indie, and people don't even know it exists. That
It's
is so
possible.
bizarre to me.
I have no idea. I'm speculating completely. I have nothing to base that on, but it's possible. You know how studios do all kinds of stuff, screenings, test screenings, and so on. Right now, it's possible that the movie wasn't testing well, and that they purposefully buried any kind of effort at marketing. They might, I'm sure they had already committed to release. It's not like they were going to pull the plug on the film, but if it didn't test well, and if they got scared, they might have just said, okay, we'll let it come out. We won't advertise it. We'll let it go out of screen, and then hopefully it won't damage the studio or the director or anything, and then he can just move on to the episode. I'm not sure. I really don't know, but it could be because I do. I've seen the trailer. I was aware of it. I definitely. It's because I search for stuff probably more than an average moviegoer. But there definitely. I don't remember seeing a lot of promotional stuff out there. Like I didn't. The trailer didn't happen to run at the head of another movie. I had to seek it out on YouTube. And while I don't really watch any more live TV, so I couldn't really say that it did or didn't play on TV. But what little I do watch of live TV still, I didn't see that play at the head of anything on TV either. So yeah, I don't know to what extent it was a concerted effort to bury the film, or whether people just ignored it for reasons X, Y, Z. I'm not sure. But it's one of those, and I have to say that, and maybe at the risk of sounding a little snobbish, or I do kind of like the fact that it's one of those movies that kind of avoided detection. And I don't. It's not. I won't go as far as oh, I'm happy it didn't do well, because then now I enjoy the fact that I like it even more. No, I wish it was doing better, or that it had gotten less bad reviews. Um, but I kind of like when there are these movies that don't necessarily tick all the boxes. Check all the boxes of the prerequisite, ready-made big film, or big public film. And in fact, I do think that, from my perspective, it's probably some of the reasons why, for those few who have seen it, some things aren't maybe registering well with the greater, the greater movie going public. It's definitely, well, to begin with, it's not a prequel, it's not a sequel, it's not a remake, it's not a reboot, it's not a reimagining. It's, there's no superheroes. So what is it? I
Yeah.
don't understand.
No, I mean that's definitely true. It is definitely like a smaller movie. And because of that, obviously, it's not going to be, it's not going to have the exposure of things like Jurassic World. But yeah, I mean, it was weird because like I had stayed like basically completely spoiler free. Not basically, like I knew literally nothing about this movie going into it. But the morning of the release, when the reviews were released, you couldn't help but see them all over the internet, and they were all talking about how epically bad it was. And that certainly colored my viewing of it, because the whole time I was watching it, I kept on thinking like, is this what they're talking about? Like, I mean, it's a bit sappy or something, but this is not, super duper terrible. And then there's the twist. And I don't really want to get, because to me, I mean, part of the joy of watching this movie, and they've kind of hidden it in the trailer a bit. They skip over like a thing in the middle, kind of,
Yep,
just
yep.
weird. But I don't want to give away too much about the plot, because to me, part of the joy, or most of the joy, of watching this movie is seeing where it goes, because
I
it
agree.
goes to some super crazy places, things that you would never expect. I mean, this is in the trailer, but there. At the start of this movie, like when the credits were rolling, if you would have told me that at some point in this movie, like Naomi Watts would be holding like a sniper rifle with like a silencer on the end of it, I would have said, you are insane, and yet that's here. And I think that's what people are responding to. I think they're, I mean, we talk a lot about this, gear shift movies, movies like Psycho or From Dusk Till Dawn, which, take a hard turn halfway through and become essentially a different movie. And this movie, I think, falls into that category. And I love movies like that. And I think that it's really throwing people off because it takes a few of those turns, and they're all in very, very weird and extreme directions. And
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that there's the two things you noted on definitely play a huge part. One, that the twist, if we and it is a twist, but I have a hard time calling it that because, and that's my own sort of biases. I haven't I don't have anything inherently against twists, but I've learned to be irritated by twists because, in my opinion, in recent years, they've been tacked on more and more as a prerequisite screenwriting formula. We have to have, a twist, and then it became, oh, well, we have to do better than the last big summer tentpole. We have to have two twists, and now we have to have three twists, and it's become kind of the same joke as like the number of villains you need to have in the film, and and so that kind of then built up this irritation I have. But the thing is, before that, I never had a problem as long as, like anything, in my opinion, as it's motivated by the story. And the reason why, I mean, it is a twist, but I wouldn't categorize it in the same place as some of the more recent ones in other movies, small or big, because in my opinion, it's, at least when I saw the movie, it felt to me, as crazy as it was, and it is, it felt like it belonged in the way, whether you like it or not. Even if I hadn't liked the movie, I wouldn't have dinged Trevorrow for it because for the story he wanted to tell, and the way he wanted to tell it, it felt like it completely belonged in that story. It wasn't a device that had been thrown in because, oh, guess what, we got to have a twist by minute 45, you know. And so that made me, for me, it had, I think, the adverse effect that I think it had for a lot of people, which is that it made me respond to it positively. And the other thing you mentioned on is the sappiness. It is for sure, and I won't even try to deny it because it's there. It is a corny movie,
mm-hmm.
but that is actually, again, part of what I loved about it. And in my opinion, again, like the twist, and there's a million factors, completely subjective, that can contribute to why you like or don't like a movie. A movie can be done exactly the way it's meant to, and depending on your mood, the time of day, the temperature, or whatever, you might go along, or you might just not be engaged. And so I'll complete somebody who doesn't like it for the corniness. I'll respect that. But for me, based on the trailer, I expected to see a movie, the kind of movie that was made when I was a kid, between 1976 and 1984 and 1985, in a good way. Not one of those, again, not one of those, oh, nostalgia grabbing, like, oh, it's the gimmick, retro is hot right now, so I'm going to throw in, the Stranger Things thing. And I like Stranger Things a lot, but where you're consciously saying, okay, well, we got to appeal to that aging demographic because we're giving them a shot reliving their childhood. Because the movie is not set in 1982 or 83 the way that Stranger Things is set. It's contemporary, but there's a feel to it from the way it's shot, the color, the desaturation, from the music, the choice in certain props. I love the fact that Naomi Watts, she has these like modern iPhone headphones, but she's listening to this cassette on an old recorder, tape recorder. She drives an old Volvo, and those are like subtle things which contribute to create. And again, even the story, the way the story is told, yes, it's corny, but in a way that felt motivated, intentional, and appropriate. And I was like, for the subject matter, the message he's trying to put out. And again, you may like it or not like it, but his choices are the right choices. Clearly, the larger, whoever saw the movie, large portion didn't respond, but I would say he still made the right choices. And what I liked is it felt like they were his personal choices, and I thought that made me really feel excited. It was one of the reasons why it made me feel excited about him, going into episode 9 after this.
Yeah, it's interesting, with the day that it came out, that night, a film critic, Todd Gilchrist, was on Twitter, and, he said, hey, I haven't seen Book of Henry, but for all these people who are, worried that episode 9 is doomed because of it, the question that I have is, as, crazy or terrible or whatever, insane, off the wall that this movie is, how is the direction? Like, does he direct the hell out of it, or is the direction the problem? And that was like a really interesting question to me, and it really made me sort of like think about the movie in that light. And I mean, the direction is good. Like, he has this script, and he's directing it to the best of his ability, to the best way anyone could direct this script. I don't see a way, aside from changing what is in the script, of making a better movie than the one that he makes. There's definitely, like you're saying, a lot of sappy stuff, a lot of corny stuff in it, and I think personally that's a problem. That stuff doesn't work for me. But the stuff that's in it that does work for me, I think is really interesting, even if it fails to some degree. Like you were saying with the twist and how it didn't feel forced like it does in some other movies. I think the difference there's two things. First off, as far as the movie is concerned, it's not a twist. Like I really get the impression that the people making the movie thought that this was just the logical progression of events, and it's only when you step back and look at it as like kind of like a whole, and maybe you're playing your expectations off of what the movie actually is, and that's when it feels like a twist. I mean, I would still consider it to be a twist myself, because the sort of like motivations of the plot and the characters and everything are completely changed. So in that sense, I do think it is a twist, but it's not like an M. Night Shyamalan twist. It's more of a just sort of like your general gear shift movie, like what's it called? Sunrise? That whatever. Anyway, doesn't matter. So there's that thing, but the other thing about it, which I think is very bizarre, and I think maybe this is the thing which I like most about it, is and I've said this a few times. It reminds me a lot of a Tyler Perry movie, in that it's absolutely crazy. Like, the stuff in here is off the wall, insane, the craziest stuff you'll ever see in a movie. And yet everyone treats it as if it's completely normal. Like, this is just like, of course she's, I was going to say the end. Of course she's going to do that thing at the end of the movie, I mean, and
it's this thing where it's like you said, it's this crazy thing, and it becomes, and this is kind of what reminded me also about the movies, from the time I mentioned, movies like The Goonies or Gremlins, where you do have these elements that are completely, if you stop to think about it, really just absurd, right? But it's set up in the world of that story. It kind of has almost that Stephen King, flavor also, of in the world of the story, it makes perfect sense, and it's treated, completely naturally. And so then, because it makes sense to the characters in their world, you go along with the adventure, right? And it reminds me of one of the tenets, one of the rules that George taught us when he was teaching us how to make the Clone Wars, where he said it's very simple, and it's so simple that after that you kind of slap your you palm your head, going, why didn't I think of it? Where he said, we hit this problem time and time again, and he told us, the reason why is because you're not trying, you're basically setting up the thing that needs to happen on page 19, and it's such a big thing because we are in this science fiction world that by the time it happens, and it's just people are finding out that needs to happen at the time it happens, now they have to digest the enormity of the idea at the time it's happening. And he said, the way it works in those types of situations for those premises is people will believe anything that's going to happen on page 19 if you tell them that it's possible on page 4.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess that's the thing, is if like this is something which I thought about. I've been thinking about this a lot since seeing the movie and looking at it sort of in different contexts and trying to sort of wrap my head around it. I was watching Jurassic World the other night, partially for this and partially because I haven't seen it since the theater, and I kept on thinking, like, if this plot, this basic plot, was not in suburbia with, just a bunch of people who could very well live next door to you, but instead was in a fantasy world where, let's say, there were dinosaurs or mutants, I mean, that was the thing that I kept on coming back to. Like, if this was an X-Men story, like, and you have, like, all of the beats, and all of the character motivations that are in this movie just set in a world with, say, superheroes, would it seem like a crazy movie?
Right,
And
you're absolutely right.
I don't think it would,
Yeah, or think about it, even if it was like a fantasy world, and you have the Naomi Watts character more kind of like a Snow White who lives in in this forest or whatever, and then you have the next door neighbor who's kind of maybe hinted at as some sort of sorcerer kind of thing, and all of a sudden people would be like, oh, okay, yeah, of course, what needs to happen needs to happen.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
It's
and
the fact.
I think it's part of the consistency also, and I think this is where in the world of this story, though, because again, if you go back and analyze it, what needs to happen, and to go back to what to that lesson that George taught us, even though it kind of escalates and it's spelled out more clearly as you go on, and then it's thrust onto kind of a path. You get the sense that the pieces are moved on the board, and pretty clearly and pretty early in the movie. You're told, even though it is, you're told without words at first, but you're still told in visuals that are very, very clearly understandable by an audience, who is who and who is doing what. Like within 10 minutes of the movie, you already have an idea of who the protagonists are and who we're supposed to root for, and who has something bad coming to them, kind of, on some level. And again, it becomes more and more clearly delineated, and then it kind of actually it's actualized to a certain degree. But you're kind of told the rules very early on, and I think that's what makes it work for me. The other thing, to go to your point about the twist and what makes it a twist but is not a twist, is that yes, there is somewhat. See, it's not even a reveal. There is a change, a gear shift. You put it very well. But at the same time, if you think about it, the central catalyst of the story doesn't really change. There is a character named Henry, and that we're not spoiling anything by saying, in the beginning, again, within like the first 2 or 3 opening scenes, is what that does. It tells us that this character is kind of like a gel, a glue that makes every other character. It's sort of, in a way, he defines all the other characters' lives, right? And that idea never changes throughout the film, all the way to the end. Regardless of the gear shift, this kind of like crest that we hit, we're still on that arc that this character, who Henry is, and what he does and what he is to those people, is what kind of brings them together, defines their orbits and their arcs. And so in that sense, it's not like that Shyamalan thing of like, oh, you thought it was a certain way, but then we shift the perspective and actually everything was upside down.
Yeah. 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 And, I mean, it's just, it's what, I mean, what's throwing people off, I think, is that it is presented so straight. It is presented like this. It could happen in our reality, and I think that people just have trouble reconciling those two things, and yet those two things are like clashing. are that's the type of thing that gets me like really excited about movies. When there is sort of like something which is very, very strange out of nowhere applied to something else which where it feels like it doesn't belong. I absolutely love that stuff. And ultimately, like, I don't think that this is a good movie because I think that the story which they're telling is kind of dumb. and I don't like respond to any of the characters. I don't have any emotional attachment to them. I didn't come out like moved by this or anything like that. And yet I was absolutely fascinated by the choices which were made and the reason why those choices were made, and sort of like the way that they were presented. And it really kind of made me sad, I guess, how like I think that in some ways, I almost feel like the people who are like hating on this movie are sort of like misplacing their aggression. I'm not saying that they should like it, but what I'm saying is like they're basically just coming out as saying this thing is like absolute garbage and doesn't know what it's doing. Whereas I think that it does know what it's doing. It's just being really, really weird, and I really, really hope that this does not discourage Trevorrow from doing weird things in the future. Because while this was, in my opinion, a failure, I would almost rather have this than something safe like, let's say, Jurassic World 2, because I feel like if he keeps on trying to do things like this, sooner or later he's going to make something which is amazing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and I think that you know, while okay, like let's talk about this one about the Book of Henry for a second, and then I'll touch on Jurassic World for another second. But you and I felt differently about the film, but where we agree is your perception, your ability to discern the fact, or to separate the fact that you didn't like the movie from the fact that the director accomplished what he was setting out to do, and respect him for that. And I think in a way that's understandable. I can't really fault the average moviegoer. They shouldn't be held necessarily to that responsibility. I wish people could, but I understand. But I think that most people who are panning the movie had the same reaction. Probably didn't like it for a lot of the same reasons. They might not. They probably are not going to be able to articulate them as well as you. But and where it gets even more confused is they're not going to be able to walk out and say, well, it's not necessarily the movie's fault, as in the filmmaker and the filmmakers behind it. It's just that movie is not for me. It's not that idea, that story, the way it's told doesn't work for me. They told it well, and there's a difference between a movie that you don't like, that is done well but that you don't like, and one that you don't like because, and I think sometimes you can put it to taste, but sometimes that's like that. But then you can also, there are movies which you can honestly say, arguably, I can say this is garbage, this is trash, this is just not well done. They either didn't try, or they didn't care, or they tried and failed. Um, so in this case, they probably won't be able to. But I completely agree. I think that actually, I'm not worried about episode 9, because I think that, and we can talk about that, but a lot of what I see in that film, um, combined with the fact that whether I liked it or not, clearly he's shown that he can also execute big films, combined with what I think, and this is purely as a fan, not as somebody who's within Lucasfilm, what I think the story group and Lucasfilm and Kathy Kennedy need and want in the directors who execute the Star Wars films that they're producing. I think that episode 9 is in as good hands as it can be, especially considering that it's the film that's going to deliver the conclusion of that trilogy. And yes, there's a lot riding on the conclusion. You have to land the plane safely, but at the same time, you come in when you have a lot of things already set up for you. The look, the tone, the characters, you do have, and this is not to say, again, this is not to say that the job is easier for him or that it requires less skill. But I think that if you look at all that and combine it with certain aspects of this film and this kind of nostalgia, this old-fashioned sense of filmmaking. There's even things about Book of Henry that reminded me. There's a ton of stuff that reminded me of films from the '70s and early '80s, but there's actually certain things about the characters that reminded me of older films, and which is what made me respond to it really well. I loved see even in smaller roles, I thought the casting was very well done. Naomi Watts has something that's very old fashioned to her. Probably one of the reasons why I've always had a big crush on her. She reminds me on some ways of kind of a Grace Kelly like quality. Lee Pace has a smaller role in the film, but there's something very. He's not at all the actiony, super buff, young guy you're gonna cast in movies. He reminds me more of a Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart type of leading man. And all of these I thought were deliberate, like tasteful choices. So based on that and the fact that he made this hugely successful film with Jurassic World, I don't think we have to worry. I personally don't think we have to worry for Episode 9. Like you said, though, I do hope that when he moves past that, he will have the courage, the ability, the desire to want to do other films, not necessarily like Book of Henry, but whatever tickles his fancy at the time. Because I'd rather, personally, I'd rather see him do this, even if it's one that I don't like because of that particular genre or whatever that he picks, than something like Jurassic World, which I'm really happy for the fact that it succeeded the way it did, and it gave him the opportunity to move forward. But that to me was what when you said playing it safe, it was a very, very, very safe movie from every angle I try to come at it. And I actually worked on it for a little while, and while I was working on it, I could see it. And again, you don't blame really any one individual, the director or the writer or even the studio, because these movies are machines that are a million components. And by the time you realize what's happening, you go, oh, okay, it's going to be one of those where, they just have to check all the boxes. And that's as a older movie fan, it's not for me, because I've seen those safe movies so many times that, I check out.
Yeah, I mean, like I enjoyed Jurassic World when I first saw it, but it was also one of those things where I kept on, like, the more I thought about it, basically the less I thought about it, in a sense, and I was just like, it really is, kind of just after Lost World, which people apparently didn't like. I mean, I don't know, I thought it was amazing, but that's just me. And then good, all right, cool. It's easily the best of the Jurassic Park movies, no doubt. And then Jurassic Park 3, which, had some issues. And, 20 years passing and all that stuff, I can totally see why, the studio and everybody, in a lot of ways, as a way of preserving, the franchise, were like, we need to get back to basics. We need to do all the things that the original did in a very similar way that Force Awakens did, when you think about it. I think Force Awakens added a lot to the mythology as well, unlike Jurassic World. But like watching Jurassic World again last night, or not a few nights ago, doesn't matter. Watching Jurassic World again recently, like, I really did enjoy it. I mean, it's a very enjoyable movie. It does check all the boxes, but they're boxes which I like to see checked. And the thing which kind of didn't like scare me with Trevorrow being hired for Episode 9, but it kind of disappointed me, was the fact that all of those boxes were just checked very, very thoroughly, and he didn't go outside of any of those boxes, really. And it really just kind of said, like, okay, I know that Episode 9 is going to be good, but there's nothing about it which is, going to make me excited, for that. And Safety Not Guaranteed, have you seen that one? His original?
No.
His first movie?
Mm-mm.
check it out. I mean, especially, if you like Book of Henry, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Obviously much smaller, but I mean, it's bizarre in that it's like this indie movie in which a guy may or may not be building a time machine. I mean, that's basically the premise. And that's weird, and it works, but at the same time it didn't, like elevate Trevorrow in my mind to a level where it's like I want to see this guy make a Star Wars movie. This movie, even though I think it is by far his worst movie, it is easily the one which makes me most excited about him directing episode 9 because like you said, Jurassic World demonstrates that he definitely can handle the scale. He definitely can be reverent to the source material or the franchise or whatever you want to call it. And yet Book of Henry suggests to me that he's willing to do something weird and crazy. And, I mean, anyone who's, worried about episode 9 after Book of Henry, I think a lot of those people haven't seen Book of Henry. I think they're just going off of word of mouth. But I also think that, maybe if you haven't seen it, check it out. And even if you don't like it, maybe you'll see that it'll be okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I would encourage people. If there's anyone out there who our voices reach, what I would say is exactly that. Is don't panic first of all, um, and I would say no one is asking you, no one is trying to convince you that Book of Henry is a masterpiece. You may like it, you may hate it. That's totally fine. But if you watch it, and even if you don't like it, like you basically, um, just appreciate the fact that it is a movie that is well made from the standpoint that it achieves what it set out to achieve. Now that may not be at all what you wanted, what you expected, etc. But you know they made a plan, and what they got at the end of the day was it looks like to me, it feels to me what they wanted to do, and so that is what should reassure you for episode 9, because their vision and their plan is something that you may hate, that you may say, okay, that's really not my cup of tea. But if you like Star Wars, what this guy proved to you here is that once the plan is made, he can execute it. And it's safe to say, and I mean that as a good thing in this particular case, especially if you're someone who didn't respond to his personal plan for Book of Henry, that when it comes to Star Wars in Episode 9, hopefully, I do hope he can bring some of his aesthetic and his choices, but that the plan, he's not going to be solely in charge of the plan. He's not going to be the lead actor even of the plan. I think that my perception, and again, this is kind of as a professional, but as a fan, just outside of me working within, is that it feels to me like the way that the Star Wars film production is being orchestrated and built up, feels to me, as the pattern develops, more like what I see in the realm of TV, where there are executives who are really the top creatives. They're the showrunners, and they're the ones deciding from the ground, what they want the story to be. They're the ones deciding what the aesthetic, the tone should be. They're the ones who are going to be involved in the pre-production, production, and post-production, and then they find the right people along the way to execute that vision. And I feel like this is what's happening with Star Wars, which makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, back then, and I remember before we even found out about the sale, and I believe all that is public. George told us, and I think this is the same information that got relayed. I am handing the keys to the castle to Kathy, and I want her to make her movies. So she's going to make her movies. This
Yeah.
is what she's done. If you go back to 1982 all the way to 2017, she has her name on pretty much every one of the biggest films in the business. So she's proven that she can bring these babies home, and at this point, she gets to make the movies she wants to make. So the plan's going to be laid out, and then you have, I think, someone in Colin Trevorrow who hopefully again can have a voice, and I hope that he can express it, but also has proven that he can bring home the baby and execute the plan.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Kennedy is really like one of only like what, like two or three people like in the world who could do this job, and I mean, definitely. And I mean, hey, so far, two movies in, I mean, the results, speak for themselves. So, yeah, for sure, for sure. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Book of Henry, as strange as it sounds, puts me a lot more. I'm not saying that my mind was not at ease regarding episode 9, but it makes me a lot more excited to see episode 9 than I had been in the past. And I mean, the other thing about it is, Trevorrow, he's got his crew, which he's started with working with on Jurassic World, and he's bringing them through this all the way to episode 9 with like John Schwartzman, who's one of my all-time favorite cinematographers, and Kevin Stitt, who's done a bunch of amazing movies as his editor and everything. And I'm excited to see them get to play in the Star Wars universe as well. So
Yeah, I agree. I love the cinematography in Book of Henry, and on the one hand, it's very simple, you could say, because the movie is much smaller, and the vista that it shows is much smaller. But at the same time, aesthetic is aesthetic, and whether you're shooting, the homestead on Tatooine, or whether you're shooting a huge vista, it makes no difference. And when you look at, again, even the smaller intimate moments on Star Wars, they're as beautiful as the big ones. So looking at the Book of Henry, I was really 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 in love with the way that the visuals played out, and that gets me really excited for what he's going to do, and the ability also for it to have a little bit of its own, hopefully, aesthetic, just like the original trilogy. Each
yeah.
movie had a different aesthetic, and I hope that translates as well. Yeah.
I think it will. I mean, Force Awakens definitely looked like a J.J. Abrams movie. It definitely looked like a Star Wars movie, but it looked like a Star Wars movie directed by Abrams. And from the 2 minutes that we've seen of what's it called, Last Jedi, Episode 8, it that definitely seems to have a bit of a Rian Johnson feel to it. And yeah, so I mean, I can only imagine. So, and apparently he's shooting. I no one's said like flat out. I don't know if he's shooting the entire movie in 70 millimeter or just portions of it, but whatever it is, hey, I mean that's cool to see some Star Wars in 70 millimeter. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Nick. I really appreciate it. This is a great conversation and very interesting perspective on the whole thing. And yeah, if listeners have seen Book of Henry and want to give us their thoughts, head on over to Facebook and find the Nerd Party, or hit us up on Twitter at Join Nerd Party, or send us a message via our website. And we'd love to hear what you think about Book of Henry and about Trevorrow directing Episode 9 for sure. So yeah, that's it for this week. Next week we will be back with Nick to take a look at some of the stuff which he has done specifically in the Clone Wars, and what he has learned along the way from the masters like George Lucas and Dave Filoni.
I am refusing to go away. I'm inviting myself over, and
You can stay
you can
for
have the
as
place.
long as you want. I mean,
Thank you.
we love having you here. So thank you very much for joining me again. I really, really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure. I've told you, off mic before we started. I've been listening to your podcasts on the Nerd Party on Trek FM, and commentary tracks that you're doing with Max, and I really really enjoy your show. So
Yeah.
it's my pleasure to participate.
And anytime you say that, like you sent me a message like a few weeks ago where you're like, "Oh, I'm at work listening to you guys talk about Jason X, and I'm laughing," and I keep on thinking like, okay, that's so bizarre to me that some guy at the ranch or wherever is like listening to me saying something like about Jason X while working on whatever new blockbuster it is, and I'm wondering if, as an editor, like, are you going to, because I say something, like hit that space bar just like 1/24 of a second later, and there's going to be an extra frame in that big, massive blockbuster because somebody working on the movie was listening to Jason X while working on it.
Yeah, I'll when the show I'm working on now comes out, and if there's a retime that's screwed up that doesn't work, I'll say, see that? I missed that because you guys with your stupid jokes made me laugh. So you can watch that and take credit for that bad motion effect or something.
I will do that for sure. I will, and then that'll make me very happy. So, yeah, thank you very much for listening, and thanks for joining me today. I really do appreciate it. All right, so yeah, be sure to tune in next week to hear some talk about some Star Wars editing.